This particular photo of Wallace, well, it's not a photo, it's a woodcut, of course, but it's taken from a photo from, I believe, 1877 or 78, and was reproduced in a short monograph by Edward Cope for a scientific society in Brooklyn. So Wallace is about 1878, he's 45 or something, no, wait a minute, 55 at this point. And I've chosen a subject today which is somewhat non-controversial, partly because I don't think anyone's identified it before. So at the end, if you have particular questions, maybe I can avoid too much controversy. But in any case, here we go. It's early Humboldtian influences on Alfred Russel Wallace's scheme of nature. Humboldtian science and the Wallace agenda. In Wallace's autobiography, My Life, published in 1905, he presents a passably detailed account of his early years, along the way discussing many of his influences and early writings. He owns up to early interests in the thoughts of, among others, Robert Owen, Robert Dale Owen, Thomas Paine, George Combe, Thomas Malthus, Sir William Lawrence, Charles Darwin, Sir Charles Lyell, and Robert Chambers. On the natural history side, Chambers and Lyell have been pointed to as the main influences, leading him in a generally uniformitarian but transmutationist direction. Three individuals have been rather overlooked in this regard, however. Alexander von Humboldt, 1769 to 1859, Franz Julius Ferdinand Mayen, 1804 to 1840, and Justus von Liebig, 1803 to 1873. It is well known that Humboldt was an important inspiration for Wallace's travels. He mentions this later in retrospect, and Humboldt's studies are well cited in his pre-1857 publications. What is largely unappreciated, however, is the degree to which Humboldt's philosophy influenced him. Wallace was familiar with Humboldt's Journal of Travels, available in English by 1814, from at least his days in Leicester in 1844 to 1845. But this work contains relatively little philosophy, being more a straightforward accounting of Humboldt's 1799 to 1804 New World travels. Two other works by Humboldt, containing a good deal more philosophy of nature, were available in England during Wallace's pre-1854 years. Aspects of Nature, 1849, and the first volumes of Cosmos, 1847. Aspects of Nature had been available in French since 1808, and it appears Wallace was able to read some French, perhaps aided by his sister, who was fluent. Wallace refers to this book in his Travels on the Amazon and Rio Negro, published in 1853, and again cites it much later in World of Life in 1910. He also uses the title, that is, Aspects of Nature, as a section heading in 3 of his books, and beyond this as a phrase in the general text of 6 of his books and articles. The situation with Cosmos is a bit more complicated. In a letter to Bates dated 28 December 1845, Wallace states how he has heard, quote, the Venerable Humboldt, unquote, supports the views expressed in Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, and how he, Wallace, has a, quote, great desire to read Cosmos. He certainly did read it eventually, as later referrals indicate, but perhaps so even before he left for South America. An English edition became available in London in early 1847, and an 1852 library catalog at the Neath Philosophical and Antiquarian Society, where Wallace volunteered as a curator circa 1845 to 1848, indicates they owned a copy of it, a copy Wallace himself might have ordered. Further, the Singapore Library owned a copy at least as early as 1860, and more importantly, so did Sir James Brooke, when Wallace stayed with him in Sarawak in 1854 and 1855. On reading the work, Wallace would have found a wide range of expressed beliefs with which he would have sympathized. The introduction to Volume 1 alone contains dozens of passages with themes visible in Wallace's later writings. Time permits of only a few examples here. So let's now scroll down if we can get my hands to do this. You can only go a page at a time. Well, we'll start with that one. So this is Humboldt now, in Volume 1 of Cosmos. General views lead us habitually to regard each organic form as a definite part of the entire creation, and to recognize in the particular plant or animal not an isolated species, but a form linked in the chain of being to other forms living or extinct. They assist us in comprehending the relations which exist between the most recent discoveries and those which have prepared the way for them. And the last two. In some other writings I'm doing right now, I have a lot more examples, but we haven't got time here to go through all those. Who will venture to affirm that we yet know with precision that part of the atmosphere which is not oxygen, or that thousands of gaseous substances affecting our organs may not be mixed with the nitrogen? Or who will say that we already know even the whole number of forces which pervade the universe? And the third quote here, the final aim of physical geography is to recognize unity in the vast variety of phenomena, and by the exercise of thought and the combination of observations, to discern that which is constant through apparent change. In the exposition of the terrestrial portion of the cosmos, we may sometimes find occasion to descend to very special facts, but it will only be for the purpose of recalling the connection existing between the laws of the actual distribution of organic beings over the surface of the globe, and the laws of the ideal classification by natural families, analogy of internal organization. Humboldt was a believer in the search for general principles, but he was an equally strong believer in the building up of science through the collection of facts. Wallace would have been delighted to hear words such as these, and coming from a leading light at that. Around the same time, Wallace seems to have consumed writings by two of Humboldt's most eminent protégés, Franz Julius Ferdinand Mayen and Justus von Liebig. Mayen died young, but before he did, he turned out one of the period's classic works on plant geography, Outlines of the Geography of Plants. It was 10 years before the work was translated into English, but by the middle of 1846, it was available in London. And Wallace's interest in it is attested by the inclusion of his name at the end of its printed list of subscribers. And he also talks about it obliquely in a letter to Bates having to do with the difficulties getting hold of a book published by the Ray Society. So it's almost certainly that book. He almost certainly read it before leaving for South America. Humboldt's influence on the book is plain, even without considering the more than 75 times Mayen references the older naturalist studies throughout it. Wallace likely would have been fascinated by its organization, which included sections titled On the Conditions of Climate which Determine the Presence and Distribution of Plants, On the Conditions by which the Soil Influences the Station and Distribution of Plants, and especially the distribution of plants over the surface of the earth. The initial pages mention Humboldt's observations on the latitudinal gradients in species numbers, in plant species numbers. And the final section introduces several themes and challenges that Wallace would later take up in his own work. For example, let's see if I can get this right. There we go. Okay, the physiognomics of vegetation teach us that nature, at the creation of plants, has distributed them over the surface of the earth according to certain laws, which are quite unknown to us. We have now learned some of the external causes which place the more developed and nobler forms of vegetation in the hot zones, but we know no cause why the same species of plants are not always produced in the same conditions of climate. And this became a later theme in his analysis of Lyell's work in terms of the relation of climate to distribution. Liebig was truly a disciple of Humboldt, as his emphasis on facts and precise experimental work demonstrates, not to mention a couple of crucial personal interventions Humboldt exercised in his interest. Curiously, and unlike Mayen, he cites Humboldt only once in his greatest work, but this was his habit. And the truth comes out in his German edition dedication to Humboldt, in which he states, roughly translated, I hardly know whether even a part of the little work which I make bold to dedicate to you is my own. Humboldt was also a leading advocate of the careful use of scientific instrumentation, and this too is a theme that shows up throughout the body of Liebig's work.